A bomb exploded at 38,000 feet. Fire was spreading fast. 198 people were screaming. But one woman in row 8 sat quietly, saying nothing, doing nothing. Until she stood up. And F-35 pilots radioed in shock, "Call sign Valkyrie, she's a Navy SEAL." Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning of February 9, 2021, arrived cold and heavy over Washington Dulles International Airport. It was a gray Tuesday, and the overnight snowstorm had finally stopped pushing flakes against the terminal windows sometime around 3 in the morning. The runways had been plowed by 5, but patches of ice still caught the halogen work lights in a dull silver glint. De-icing trucks moved slowly along the tarmac, spraying orange fluid across the wings of parked aircraft, their warning lights rotating in the dark. The sky above the airport was the color of old dishwater, flat and low and unwilling to brighten. Inside the terminals, early morning travelers moved sluggishly, wrapped in winter coats, clutching coffee cups with both hands, dragging rolling bags across the polished floors with the particular exhausted determination of people who had set alarms for 4 in the morning and deeply regretted it. At Gate C-42, the boarding process for Delta Airlines Flight 1847 to San Diego was just beginning. A gate agent named Patricia was making her announcement in that practiced airport voice, calm and slightly robotic, explaining boarding zones and carry-on bag size requirements. The aircraft waiting outside the windows was a Boeing 767-300ER, a wide-body twin-engine jet configured to carry 218 passengers on this transcontinental route connecting the nation's capital to the Southern California coast. It was not a glamorous flight. It was a Tuesday morning flight filled with government contractors in cheap blazers, military families with strollers and overfull diaper bags, and business travelers who had long since stopped finding airports interesting. People filed toward the gate with their boarding passes extended, some on phones, some staring at nothing, most simply waiting for the minor bureaucracy of boarding to end so they could find their seats and go to sleep. Among all these people, one woman moved through the boarding line in a way that was specifically designed to make you forget her the moment you looked away. She was tall, perhaps 5 feet 9, with a lean and powerful build that suggested serious athletic conditioning without advertising it. Her skin was fair in the way of people descended from cold northern climates, and her hair was platinum blonde, cut to a practical shoulder length and tucked behind her ears without ceremony. Her eyes, if you happened to look directly into them, were a pale ice blue that registered as unusual before your brain moved on to something else. She was wearing dark gray joggers, a plain black North Face fleece zipped to her throat, and white Nike running shoes that looked nearly new. She carried only a small black backpack with no visible patches, no logo, no identifying marks of any kind. In her right hand was a paperback novel, Joe Nesbo's The Snowman, the cover worn at the corners from previous handling. She boarded without speaking to anyone. She found her seat, 8C, an aisle seat on the starboard side, third row from the front of the main cabin, and she settled into it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had occupied many different seats in many different vehicles over many years and had long since made peace with the physical reality of tight spaces. She positioned the book at chest height, angled her shoulders slightly toward the window, and arranged her body language into a configuration that clearly communicated she had no interest in conversation. It was not an unfriendly posture. It was simply a closed one, radiating a self-contained quality that made other passengers unconsciously respect the boundary without quite knowing why they were doing so. You were in seat 8D, the middle seat directly next to her. You had known it was going to be a middle seat when you booked the ticket 3 weeks ago and had resigned yourself to it. You sat down, noticed the tall blonde woman reading her Nordic thriller, registered the body language, respected it immediately, and went back to your phone. You had absolutely no idea who was sitting next to you. None of the other 216 passengers had any idea either. There was no way to know. That was exactly the point. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Astrid Larson. She was 32 years old. She was a member of the United States Navy, assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command, and she was one of only 6 women currently serving in an active duty capacity as a Navy SEAL. Since 2016, when the Pentagon formally opened all combat positions to women, a small number of women had passed the qualification program. The attrition rate was staggering. Most candidates, male and female, did not make it through basic underwater demolition, the notoriously brutal initial selection known as BUD/S. Astrid had made it through on her first attempt, a fact that was noted in her training record without fanfare because Astrid did not believe in fanfare. She had then gone on to complete every additional qualification required of a SEAL operator: SEAL qualification training, freefall parachuting, combat diving, advanced weapons systems, tactical medicine, advanced firefighting school, explosive ordnance response, and a list of specialized courses that went on for a full page in her personnel file. She had completed 9 overseas deployments. Iraq, twice. Afghanistan, 3 times. Syria once. Yemen twice. And 1 additional deployment to a country that did not appear on her official record because the United States government had not formally acknowledged conducting operations there. On those deployments, she had participated in direct action raids against high-value targets, counterterrorism operations coordinated with Allied Special Operations Units, intelligence-gathering missions that required her to operate in environments where her cover identity could not afford a single mistake, and hostage rescue operations that required speed, violence of action, and the kind of cold decision-making under pressure that most people will never experience and would not want to. Her call sign was Valkyrie. She had not chosen it. Call signs were earned, given by teammates based on something that happened or something someone noticed, and then they stuck. Hers came from her 3rd deployment to Yemen, during an operation that had since been classified at a level that most officers in the building would never read. She had led a team into an Al-Qaeda compound outside Sana'a with the mission of extracting 12 aid workers who had been held captive for 63 days. The compound had more personnel than the intelligence briefing had suggested. The extraction window was narrower than planned. She had made rapid sequential decisions under fire about which threats to neutralize first to maximize the probability of all 12 hostages surviving the extraction, and every decision she made had been correct. All 12 aid workers came home. 3 enemy combatants were eliminated with surgical precision in the sequence Astrid had calculated was optimal. A teammate had looked at her in the aftermath, in the rotary aircraft carrying them back to the ship, and said quietly, "You chose who lived and who died in there." Like a Valkyrie. The name had spread through Naval Special Warfare Command faster than Astrid could stop it, not that she tried very hard to stop it. She had been shot twice. The first time was in Mosul, Iraq, during a raid on a network financing cell. The round struck her left shoulder and exited cleanly, and she had continued the mission for 11 minutes before a teammate noticed she was losing blood and insisted on a field dressing during the exfiltration. She received 9 stitches aboard a Navy vessel in the Persian Gulf and was back on operational status in 4 days. The second time was in Syria, during an Overwatch mission that went wrong when the building across the street turned out to be occupied by a secondary element that had not appeared in the pre-mission reconnaissance. The bullet went through her right thigh, missing the femoral artery by what the trauma surgeon later described as a medically improbable distance. She was medevac that time. She was out for 3 weeks. She considered this a significant inconvenience. She had also survived an IED blast in Afghanistan that killed her interpreter, a man named Tariq who had a wife and 3 daughters and who had been working with American Special Operations Forces because he believed it was the right thing to do for his country. The blast had thrown Astrid 15 feet and briefly knocked her unconscious, and she had woken up with her ears ringing and blood on her face that was mostly Tariq's. She had written his name in a small notebook she kept in the left pocket of every deployment bag she ever packed. She had never stopped carrying that notebook. She had once conducted a 72-hour solo reconnaissance mission in hostile territory in eastern Afghanistan with a fractured ankle because the extraction helicopter had been forced off its schedule by weather and an alternate window was not available for 3 days. She had splinted the ankle herself using materials from her kit and had completed the mission. All of this background, all of these deployments and wounds and call signs and classified operations, was completely invisible on the morning of February 9, 2021, as she sat in seat 8C reading Joe Nesbo. She was not thinking about Yemen or Mosul or that notebook or Tariq. She was trying very hard not to think about anything at all, which was itself a kind of thinking, a constant mental labor of redirection. 3 weeks ago, on January 19, a training exercise off the coast of Virginia had gone catastrophically wrong. A helicopter carrying members of her SEAL team had gone down in cold water during a nighttime maritime insertion exercise. Mechanical failure, the investigation would later determine. 3 of her teammates had died. Not in combat, not on a deployment, not while doing anything that would be reported in a newspaper or remembered in a ceremony, just gone, in cold dark water during a training exercise off the coast of Virginia on a Tuesday in January, while Astrid had clung to a piece of wreckage and watched and been unable to reach them in time. The Navy's Psychological Evaluation Unit had determined she was experiencing acute stress response. They had mandated 2 weeks of leave before she could return to operational status. She had contested this determination. She had lost that argument. Her commanding officer had been gentle about it in a way that somehow made it worse, sitting across from her in his office and telling her that the mandatory leave was not a reflection on her capability but on the Navy's responsibility to its people, and that she should take the time to be with her family. Her family was her older sister Ingrid, who lived in San Diego and was getting married in 3 days, and her parents, Norwegian immigrants who had settled outside Minneapolis decades ago and who had been asking Astrid to come home for the better part of 3 years. Ingrid had called her specifically about the wedding. Their mother had gotten on the phone and said, in the particular tone that mothers deploy when they are stating a fact rather than making a request, "You need to be around family right now. You are not going to sit alone in your apartment and stare at the walls." She had agreed because she knew they were right. She knew she had been isolating. She knew the nightmares of cold water and the faces of her teammates were getting worse, not better. She knew she needed to be somewhere that was not her apartment in Virginia Beach, where everything reminded her of people who were no longer there. So she had packed a bag, one small black backpack, because she owned almost nothing that was not related to her work, and the backpack held everything she needed for a week, and she had booked a ticket on Delta Flight 1847 to San Diego. And she was now reading a Joe Nesbo thriller because the Norwegian names and the cold Scandinavian atmosphere reminded her of her childhood and provided a comfort that she could not quite explain to anyone and did not try to. The aircraft pushed back from the gate at 6:51 in the morning, 14 minutes behind schedule due to the de-icing process taking longer than planned. The taxi to the runway took another 12 minutes because of ice clearance protocols requiring ground crews to walk the entire runway before aircraft could use it. Astrid read her book. Outside the window, the gray Virginia sky pressed down on the airport like a low ceiling, and the orange glow of the work lights reflected in the icy patches on the taxiway. The Boeing 767 reached the runway, held for 2 minutes while a landing aircraft cleared, then accelerated and lifted into the heavy gray morning. Astrid turned a page. The flight settled into its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet over Virginia and began its westward track across the country. Breakfast service started around 7:45. Astrid accepted a coffee and declined everything else. You ordered orange juice and a small bag of pretzels. The cabin was quiet in the particular way that early morning flights are quiet, people sleeping against neck pillows, people with headphones watching laptop screens, the subdued murmur of the few who were talking. The overhead lighting was dim. A child in row 12 was asking her mother with some persistence why the clouds were below them instead of above, and her mother was explaining with equal persistence that this was just how it worked on airplanes, a conversation they had clearly been having for some time. At 8:55 in the morning Eastern Time, the aircraft was at 38,000 feet over the state of Kansas, approximately 900 miles west of Washington and 1,100 miles east of San Diego, which put it as close to the midpoint of the route as a navigator could ask for. Astrid was deep in chapter 12 of her book, in the middle of a scene set in Oslo in November where a detective was standing in the snow outside an apartment building looking at something he did not yet understand. The cabin was warm and quiet. Then the back of the aircraft exploded. It was not the enormous, movie-sized explosion that most people imagine when they hear the word. It was contained, more of a sharp concussive bang followed immediately by a deep metallic groan from the structure of the aircraft, and then a sound that every aviation professional and every frequent flyer recognizes as one of the worst sounds possible on an aircraft, the rapid whoosh of pressurized air escaping through a breach in the fuselage. The oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments in the same moment, cascading down in a row from front to back, and the cabin pressure began dropping immediately. Within 4 seconds, the atmospheric pressure inside the aircraft had equalized to something approaching the pressure at 25,000 feet above sea level, which is high enough that an unprotected person begins to experience significant cognitive impairment within about 90 seconds. The screaming started at the same moment the masks dropped. It was not a unified scream, not a chorus, it was the jagged, overlapping sound of 198 individual people experiencing sudden terror in an enclosed space, some screaming outright, some calling out names, some simply making sounds that were not quite words because the part of the brain that generates words had been momentarily overridden by the part that responds to sudden explosive decompression at altitude. A baby in row 9 was wailing. A man somewhere in the middle of the aircraft was shouting something in a language that was not English. The smell of smoke reached the front of the cabin 2 seconds after the explosion, thin at first but thickening, a sharp electrical smell mixed with something that burned hot and chemical. In the cockpit, Captain William Brooks and First Officer Jennifer Nakamura had responded to the explosion before the first scream reached them. Brooks had 17,000 flight hours, 46 years of age, 19 years with Delta, and a calm that his colleagues described as almost unsettling in normal circumstances and invaluable in abnormal ones. Nakamura had 8,900 hours and 11 years of commercial flying after a career as an Air Force C-17 pilot, which meant she had landed aircraft in conditions that most commercial pilots never encountered. They both understood immediately what had happened and what needed to happen next. Brooks declared an emergency on the radio. Nakamura began the emergency descent checklist. The aircraft began dropping, trading altitude for breathable air, pushing the nose down to get the plane below 10,000 feet where passengers could breathe without oxygen masks. They also had fire warnings on 2 systems. They also had control surface anomalies that suggested the explosion had damaged something in the tail section. They also had a cabin crew that was being overwhelmed. Marcus Reed had been a flight attendant for Delta for 18 years. He was 44 years old and had handled his share of incidents, a cardiac event over the Atlantic, an unruly passenger in first class who had needed to be restrained with zip ties, a severe turbulence event that had injured 2 passengers and required emergency medical response. He had never handled anything like this. He was in the forward galley when the explosion hit, and he had steadied himself against the galley frame and immediately begun trying to move toward the rear of the aircraft to assess the situation, but the passengers were already moving in the opposite direction, away from the smoke that was thickening in the rear third of the cabin, and the flow of frightened people and the narrowness of the aisle made forward progress nearly impossible. He was calling out instructions in his trained emergency voice, telling people to put on their oxygen masks and return to their seats, but the trained emergency voice was designed for situations that were bad, and this situation was beyond bad, and the voice was not carrying through the noise of the screaming. He was about to try a different approach when a hand touched his arm. She had moved from seat 8C through the chaos of the forward cabin with the same fluid economy of motion with which she had boarded the aircraft 2 hours ago, but there was nothing nondescript about her now. She moved through panicking passengers the way water moves through a channel, not forcing, just finding the path of least resistance and taking it without hesitation. Her face was calm. Not the frozen stillness of someone in shock, but the active, directed calm of someone who had already assessed the situation, identified the priority actions, and begun executing. When she reached Marcus she looked at him directly, and her ice-blue eyes were steady and clear. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Astrid Larson, United States Navy SEAL," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was pitched and projected in a way that cut through the ambient noise without effort, the way voices trained to give orders under fire cut through ambient noise. "I'm trained in mass casualty crisis management, fire suppression, explosive ordnance response, and emergency medical procedures. You have approximately 4 minutes before that fire reaches critical aircraft systems. I can help you organize evacuation priorities, manage passenger panic, and coordinate with the cockpit on emergency protocols. Let me help you save these people. Marcus Reed stared at her for just under 2 seconds. He was a practical man, and in those 2 seconds, he conducted an involuntary but rapid evaluation. She was calm while everyone around her was not. She had used specific technical language that suggested genuine training rather than wishful thinking. She had identified the fire timeline which indicated she understood aircraft systems, and most importantly, she had come to him instead of doing what every other passenger was doing, which was trying to get as far from the back of the aircraft as possible. He said, "What do you need?" What she needed was 30 seconds of his authority. She got it in 15. Marcus turned to the cabin with his emergency voice at full volume and announced that a Navy specialist was taking command of emergency response and that all passengers needed to listen. It was not standard Delta procedure. It was the right call. The announcement did not stop the panic immediately, but it shifted the energy slightly, introduced a new variable into the chaos that made some portion of the passengers hesitate and look toward the front of the aircraft instead of continuing to push. Astrid moved through the cabin. She had made the decision before she left her seat that she was going to divide the tasks the way she would divide them on a mission: identify the strongest and calmest available resources, assign them specific zones and specific responsibilities, create a structure out of the chaos before the chaos caused more damage than the original emergency. She found a large man in a flannel shirt in row 14 who was sitting with his hands pressed flat on his armrests and his jaw set, which indicated he was scared but controlling it. She touched his shoulder and said, "I need you at the overwing exit right now. Your job is to help people through that exit in an organized line. Nobody pushes. Nobody cuts. You tell them one at a time, we're not using that exit yet, but when I give the signal you'll be in charge of that door. Can you do that?" He said yes without hesitation and moved to the exit with the focused urgency of someone who had been given permission to do something useful. She found a woman in row 11 in dark green scrubs who was applying her oxygen mask with the systematic calm of someone with medical training. "Are you medical?" Astrid asked. The woman said she was a nurse. Astrid said, "There's a man in row 22 with a head wound from when the explosion threw him against the seat back. I need you treating that injury right now." The nurse moved without further question. She found a retired schoolteacher named Gerald in row 16 who was 67 years old and terrified but holding together because he had spent 31 years managing rooms full of children in crisis situations and old habits did not entirely disappear. She told him he was responsible for keeping passengers calm in rows 15 through 20, to talk to them, tell them someone was handling it, tell them to stay in their seats with masks on. Gerald straightened in his seat, took a breath, and began talking to the woman across the aisle from him in a steady, measured voice. Within 4 minutes of the explosion, Astrid had placed 7 passenger volunteers in 7 specific roles across the cabin, had given Marcus a clear picture of which exits would be used in what order based on where the fire was and which exits were structurally sound, and had accounted for the 4 passengers who needed priority assistance during evacuation because of age or injury. Then she picked up 4 fire extinguishers from the galley and the overwing exit compartments, slung 2 of them over each shoulder the way she had been trained to carry them in firefighting school, and walked toward the back of the aircraft. The smoke was thick in the rear third of the cabin. People were moving away from it with the instinctive urgency of animals moving away from fire, which is the right instinct in a building and the wrong instinct on an aircraft at 38,000 feet where there is nowhere to go. Astrid moved against the flow. The smoke was the bitter, acrid smoke of an electrical fire. She identified it by smell and by the way it sat low and dense rather than rising, and she knew what that meant about where the source was. The rear galley on a Boeing 767 has specific fire suppression access points that she had studied once in a course she had attended 3 years ago because Naval Special Warfare Command sends its operators to unusual courses, and she had filed the information away in the section of her memory where things that might someday be useful were stored. She had not expected to use it on a Tuesday morning in February over Kansas. She used it now. She got low below the worst of the smoke. She moved through the rear galley in a crouch. The fire was in the electrical panel behind the aft galley wall, and it had spread along a conduit in a way that was moving it toward the fuel management systems in the tail section. If it reached the fuel management systems, the situation would become significantly worse very quickly. She found the access panel. The metal was hot to the touch. She braced herself, opened the panel, and engaged the first extinguisher. The heat was considerable. The fire resisted the first extinguisher with the stubbornness of a fire that has been burning for 5 minutes and believes it has rights. She engaged the second extinguisher. The smoke intensified for a moment before it started to thin. Her eyes were streaming from the smoke, but she kept them open because she needed to see what she was doing. Her hands found hot metal more than once during the process, and she felt the burning but registered it as information rather than as a reason to stop. She was operating in the same focus state she had operated in on missions, the state where time slowed slightly and the only things that existed were the immediate problem and the solution to the immediate problem. She engaged the third extinguisher on a secondary flare that attempted to establish itself along the conduit running toward the tail. She was in the rear galley for 11 minutes. When she finally backed out of the smoke with her face covered in black soot and the red marks of heat burns on both hands, she found Marcus Reed standing at the boundary of where the smoke thinned, staring at her. He had positioned himself there because he needed to be able to communicate with both the rear of the aircraft and the forward cabin, and also because some part of him had been unwilling to simply leave the woman who had walked into the fire alone. "You went in there," he said. "Alone." "I've extracted hostages from burning buildings under enemy fire," she said. Her voice was slightly rougher from the smoke. "This was just fire. Now let's get these passengers ready to land." "What's our altitude?" Marcus checked the status update on his interphone. 11,000 feet. "Captain says we're about 8 minutes from Wichita Mid-Continent." "Good," Astrid said. She handed him the spent fire extinguishers. "The fire suppressed but not completely out. I need someone monitoring that rear galley every 90 seconds until we're on the ground. I need to speak to the captain." She went forward to the cockpit and knocked on the door. The door opened on the second knock. Captain William Brooks was a broad-shouldered man with gray at his temples and the focused expression of someone managing 3 simultaneous emergencies while flying a damaged aircraft toward a runway he had never landed on before. He looked at the soot-covered woman in the doorway and said, "You're the SEAL." "Lieutenant Commander Astrid Larson," she said. "I've suppressed the rear cabin fire. It's not completely extinguished, but it's no longer spreading toward your fuel systems. You have passengers who are ready to land, but they're going to need proper brace coaching. Your flight attendant is managing the cabin effectively. What do you need from me?" Brooks assessed her for approximately 1 second, which was all the time he had. "Make sure those passengers are in proper brace positions," he said. "This is going to be a hard landing. The tail control surfaces are degraded and I'm going to be fighting the aircraft through the flare. Make sure everyone is braced and make sure your volunteers are at those exits the instant we stop." "Understood," Astrid said. She looked at Jennifer Nakamura, who had turned briefly from the instruments to look at her, and nodded once. Nakamura nodded back. Astrid returned to the cabin. Outside the aircraft, at an altitude of 9,000 feet over eastern Kansas and closing rapidly on the Wichita metropolitan area, 2 F-35 Lightning II fighters from the 1st Fighter Wing at Joint Base Langley Eustis had arrived on scene. They had been scrambled at 9:03 in the morning when Flight 1847's transponder had shifted to emergency code 7700, 45 seconds after the explosion. The pilot of the lead aircraft was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, call sign Havoc, 39 years old, 17 years in the Air Force, 2,800 hours total time, combat deployments to 2 theaters he preferred not to discuss at parties. He had intercepted 4 aircraft in his career. This was the first one he had intercepted that appeared to be coming apart while actively maintaining altitude. He established radio contact with Flight 1847 on the guard frequency. "Delta 1847, this is Havoc, we're at your 7 o'clock, 2 miles. I have you visual. Declare your situation." Captain Brooks responded in the clipped, efficient voice of a pilot managing degraded aircraft systems, Havoc, Delta 1847. We had an explosion and fire in the rear section, currently under control. We have degraded tail surfaces, explosive decompression, and 198 passengers. We have a Navy SEAL on board who suppressed the fire and organized the cabin emergency response. Attempting emergency landing Wichita mid-continent in approximately 6 minutes. Request your escort. There was a pause from the fighter. Delta 1847, confirm, you have a SEAL on board. Can you identify them? Brooks looked at his first officer. Nakamura was already reaching for the interphone. She called the cabin, and 30 seconds later, Astrid was back at the cockpit door, still covered in soot. Brooks handed her the radio handset. She pressed the transmit key. This is Lieutenant Commander Astrid Larson, SEAL Team 18, currently managing passenger crisis response on board Delta 1847. The frequency was silent for 2 seconds. Then Havoc's voice came back, controlled but edged with something beneath the professionalism. Delta 1847, request your SEAL operator confirm call sign for identification. Astrid pressed the transmit key again. Havoc, call sign is Valkyrie. Call sign Valkyrie. SEAL Team 18. The frequency went silent for exactly 4 seconds. It was the kind of silence that happens on a radio channel when the person on the other end has stopped everything, stopped scanning instruments, stopped monitoring secondary frequencies, stopped doing whatever they were doing, and is simply sitting with what they just heard. Then Havoc's voice came back, and what was in it was not standard military radio procedure, a quality that every person monitoring that frequency that morning would remember and repeat to others for years afterward. Call sign Valkyrie. Delta 1847, copy that, you have a legend on board. The operator from the Yemen hostage rescue. The most decorated female SEAL in Naval Special Warfare Command is managing your emergency right now. You are in the best possible hands. Wichita has 4 trucks rolling to the runway. We have you covered from up here. Bring them home. Captain Brooks, for the first time since the explosion, allowed himself a single breath that was not purely functional. Then he returned his full attention to flying the damaged aircraft. In the back, Astrid was already moving through the cabin row by row. The brace position briefing took her 4.5 minutes, which was all the time she had. She moved from row to row with the steady purposeful pace of someone covering ground efficiently, stopping at each row for approximately 10 seconds, checking that every passenger had their feet flat on the floor, their seatbelts properly tightened, their hands correctly positioned, and understood what was about to happen. When passengers were crying, she did not tell them not to cry. She said, clearly and simply, the pilot knows what he's doing. The fire is out. You are going to land. I need you in this position right now. The combination of the direct statement, the calm delivery, and the fact that she was demonstrably still present and still working, still soot-covered and clearly uninjured from whatever she had done in the back of the aircraft, had a visible effect. The crying continued, but the panic did not escalate. People looked at her and then looked at their hands and then positioned their hands correctly. She assigned her 7 volunteers to their designated exits with final instructions. She positioned the 4 priority passengers, 2 elderly, 1 with the head wound that the nurse had stabilized, 1 with a broken wrist from falling during the initial decompression event, at the 2 forward exits where the drop to the evacuation slide would be shortest and the distance to move was least. She briefed Marcus Reed on the evacuation sequence she wanted: forward exits first, then over wing, then rear exits only if the fire situation permitted. She told him she would do a final sweep of the entire aircraft before she exited, and she told him not to argue with her about it. He did not argue with her about it. The Wichita Mid-Continent Airport had 4 emergency vehicles on the runway by the time Flight 1847 appeared in the eastern sky at 9:22 in the morning, descending fast and slightly nose-high in the way of aircraft with compromised tail surfaces trying to maintain attitude control through a degraded flare. Captain Brooks fought the airplane through the last 800 feet of descent with the kind of Physical and mental effort that does not show up in accident reports because there are no instruments for it. The landing was hard, the main gear touching with a jolt that transmitted through every seat and overhead bin in the aircraft, and for 1/2 second the aircraft yawed slightly left before Brooks corrected it and it straightened and rolled out. The aircraft stopped at the intersection of runway 19 left and the first rapid exit taxiway, 1,800 feet from the threshold. All 8 emergency exits deployed simultaneously, the evacuation slides inflating with a sound like a giant exhale. The first passengers were on the slides within 4 seconds of the aircraft coming to a full stop. Astrid had positioned herself at the forward left exit, the door that Marcus Reed was operating. She was not evacuating. She was counting. She had a mental model of the aircraft's passenger load, 198 passengers plus 4 crew, and she was running the count as people came through from their rows, watching the flow, calling out to her volunteers at the other exits through the open doors to keep the movement steady. When the rear section began thinning, she moved down the aisle against the last trickle of passengers, checking every row, checking every overhead compartment that was large enough to conceal a person, opening every lavatory door, confirming visually that each section was empty. She moved from the rear of the aircraft to the front with the systematic efficiency of a building clearance, which is in fact what she was doing, because a building clearance was the template she had for this and it was a good template. The last passenger came off the aircraft 87 seconds after the first exit had deployed. Every one of them made it down the slides and onto the tarmac and away from the aircraft before the fire trucks even reached the aircraft's position. When the first firefighter boarded the aircraft through the forward left door, he found a tall woman covered in soot standing in the aisle doing a final visual sweep of the rear cabin. "Ma'am," the firefighter said, "you need to evacuate. There's still fire risk." "I don't leave until I confirm 0 casualties on board," Astrid said, without turning around. "That's the job. Help me check the lavatories." He helped her check the lavatories. They were empty. She walked forward to the exit and stepped onto the evacuation slide and rode it down to the tarmac, and when her feet touched the ground she stood for a moment in the cold Kansas air and looked at the damaged aircraft behind her and the crowd of passengers standing at the safe perimeter and the emergency vehicles surrounding the aircraft, and she took a single breath that was slightly longer than a normal breath, and then she walked toward the triage area where the nurse in the green scrubs was working on the man with the head wound. The final count, determined by investigators over the following 72 hours, was this: 198 passengers and 4 crew members, all survived. 11 passengers had sustained injuries, 9 cases of mild to moderate smoke inhalation, 1 broken arm sustained when a passenger had fallen during the initial decompression event and been trampled briefly before the flow of people was organized, and 1 serious laceration from the explosion's debris that had required field treatment during the flight and surgery after landing. 0 fatalities. The investigation that followed was extensive. The TSA employee responsible for the attack, a man who had been radicalized through an online network over 14 months and had exploited his access credentials to smuggle explosive components onto aircraft over multiple shifts, was identified within 36 hours and arrested within 48. The investigation into how he had been able to do it, and what security changes were required to prevent it from happening again, took considerably longer and resulted in procedural changes that the TSA did not advertise publicly. The investigation into the emergency response on board the aircraft was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, by Delta Airlines' internal safety team, and by a Naval Special Warfare Command liaison officer who had been dispatched primarily to ensure that any classified information pertaining to Lieutenant Commander Larson's identity or unit assignment was handled appropriately. The investigators' conclusions were consistent across all 3 inquiries. The explosive decompression and fire, in a fully normal cabin without the interventions that occurred, would statistically have been expected to result in a minimum of 20 fatalities from the explosion's direct effects and the subsequent fires spread to critical aircraft systems. The organized crisis management of the passenger population had prevented secondary casualties that the investigators estimated at between 15 and 30 additional fatalities, based on modeling of what happens to aircraft evacuations when passenger panic is not controlled. The fire suppression had been the single most critical intervention, because without it the aircraft's fuel management systems would have been compromised within approximately 3 minutes, at which point the aircraft's structural integrity would have been in immediate jeopardy at 38,000 feet over the Great Plains. The investigators also noted, in a section of the report that was later quoted in news articles around the world, that the evacuation of 198 passengers in 87 seconds represented the fastest recorded civilian aircraft evacuation in a real emergency situation. The media learned about it on the third day. The initial report came from a passenger who had posted on social media about being saved by a female Navy SEAL, and the story spread from there with the speed that stories about things most people did not know were possible tend to spread when they turn out to be true. Most Americans did not know that women could be Navy SEALs. The combination of that information with the story of what Astrid had done on Flight 1847 created a news cycle that the Navy's Public Affairs Office was not fully prepared for, which is perhaps understandable since they had not been fully prepared for the existence of female SEALs to become a major news story during an ordinary Tuesday in February. Astrid herself was not in Virginia when the story broke. She was in San Diego. She had arrived the day after the emergency landing, having taken a commercial flight from Wichita to Los Angeles and a connecting flight to San Diego, because she had promised Ingrid she would be at the wedding and she had no intention of breaking that promise. She had showered at the Wichita airport and bought a clean shirt from the terminal gift shop and flown to California with her soot-smelling backpack and her copy of The Snowman, which had a scorch mark on the back cover from when she had set it on the galley counter during the fire suppression. She arrived at Ingrid's apartment with 12 hours to spare before the rehearsal dinner. Ingrid had opened the door, looked at her sister, looked at the news notifications on her phone, and said simply, "You couldn't just be a bridesmaid for 4 days, could you?" Astrid had said, "I was a passenger. Something happened. How do I look in blue?" The reporters found her at the wedding reception, which was held at a restaurant overlooking San Diego Bay. There were 4 of them, which Ingrid considered an intrusion and which Astrid considered a manageable number. She was wearing a cobalt blue bridesmaid's dress that was considerably less practical than her usual clothing and which she wore with the same relaxed competence she wore everything. Her hair was down. The soot was completely gone. The burn marks on her hands were covered by a bandage that the hotel's first aid kit had provided. One of the reporters, a woman from a national television network who had been covering defense and security for 11 years and who had specifically requested this assignment because she had been trying to do a story on female SEALs for 2 years without success, asked Astrid how she had stayed calm when everyone around her was panicking. Astrid considered the question for a moment. She looked at the reporters, then out at the bay, where the lights of the Coronado Bridge were reflecting in the dark water. Then she looked back. "I'm a SEAL," she said. "We train for crisis. We don't panic when things go wrong, we shift into mission execution mode. Today the mission was keeping 218 people alive. I used the same skills I use in combat: assess the threat, prioritize responses, organize resources, execute with precision, adapt to changing conditions, complete the mission. The only difference was instead of extracting hostages from a compound, I was extracting passengers from an aircraft. Different environment. Same principles." She paused. She looked back at the bay for a moment. And honestly, those passengers were incredible. They listened. They followed instructions. They helped each other. They're the real heroes. I just gave them organization and leadership. That's what SEALs do, we lead in crisis. That's the job. That's who we are. We're Valkyries. We choose who lives and dies. And today I chose that everyone lives." She turned back to the reporters and her expression was calm and direct and completely composed. "Mission accomplished," she said. On the tarmac at Wichita Mid-Continent Airport, in the cold February air with the smell of smoke still drifting from the aircraft's tail, Astrid moved through the triage area with the same systematic precision she had applied to everything else. The nurse in the green scrubs, whose name turned out to be Diana Torres and who had been a trauma nurse in Denver for 11 years, had set up a competent treatment area using the first aid kits from the emergency vehicles and was working through the smoke inhalation cases methodically. Astrid checked in with her, confirmed the status of the most serious injuries, and then moved to the perimeter of the crowd where some passengers were sitting on the grass and some were standing and some were still in shock enough that they were just looking at the aircraft as if trying to understand what had happened to them. She moved among them quietly. She was not the most visible person on that tarmac. The paramedics and firefighters and airport security personnel were all doing their jobs with competence and purpose, but people noticed her. She was still covered in soot. People who had been on the aircraft had seen her move through the smoke. They stopped her when they recognized her, not to ask questions, just to make some kind of contact, as if being near her for a moment was itself stabilizing. A man in his 50s gripped her arm and said nothing, just held on for 3 seconds. A woman with 2 small children pulled the older child close and said to Astrid, "Thank you." A teenager who had been sitting in row 21 and who had been told by Astrid during the brace briefing to breathe, "You're going to be fine, just keep breathing," looked at her now with the particular expression of someone who had just discovered that some people are genuinely different from other people, that the quality she had assumed was simply a movie convention, the person who remains calm when everything is falling apart, was actually real and existed in the world. The man in the flannel shirt from row 14, the one she had assigned to the overwing exit, found her at the edge of the crowd. His name was Tom Briggs, and he was a contractor from Arlington who worked on infrastructure projects and who had been on his way to San Diego for a site review. He had managed the overwing exit with the controlled urgency she had asked for, keeping the flow organized, calling out to people in a clear voice, making sure nobody went too fast or too slow or froze on the threshold. He stood in front of her now and said, "I've never done anything like that in my life." "You did exactly what was needed," she said. "You were steady under pressure. That matters more than almost anything." Tom Briggs nodded slowly. He looked back at the aircraft, still surrounded by fire trucks. "I didn't even know women could be SEALs," he said. "Most people don't," Astrid said. "That's fine." The Wichita Fire Department's incident commander, a man named Captain Robert Espinoza who had 22 years in aviation firefighting, sought her out while the situation on the tarmac was stabilizing. He had reviewed the fire suppression in the rear galley with his crew and he wanted to understand what had been done. She walked him through it directly, using precise technical language about the access panel location, the extinguisher sequence, the spread pattern of the electrical fire. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You've had aviation firefighting training." "Advanced firefighting course at NAVSOC," she said. 3 years ago. "You did the right things in the right order," he said. "If that fire had reached the fuel management conduit, we'd be having a very different conversation." She nodded. She already knew that. Captain William Brooks found her before she left the tarmac. He had been with the NTSB investigators for 40 minutes and he had answered every question they had about the flight, the emergency procedures, the instrument readings, the approach to Wichita, and he had given them a complete account of what Lieutenant Commander Larson had done from the moment she appeared at the cockpit door. Now he walked across the tarmac to where she was standing and he looked at her for a moment in the way that people look at each other when they have shared something that has no ordinary category. "First Officer Nakamura wanted me to tell you something," he said. "She's a former Air Force pilot. She said she's worked with a lot of special operations people over the years and she's never seen anyone keep that kind of composure in a situation that was actively getting worse. She said she wanted to say that directly." "Please tell her I said thank you," Astrid said. She and Captain Brooks flew a damaged aircraft to a runway they'd never used. "That's not nothing." Brooks was quiet for a moment. "My daughter is 9 years old," he said. "I'm going to tell her about you." Astrid did not know what to say to that. She said, "Tell her the job matters. Whatever job she chooses. The job matters." Brooks nodded. He extended his hand. She shook it. He went back to the investigators and she went to look for a phone to call her sister and tell her she was going to be a little late. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, call sign Havoc, landed at McConnell Air Force Base outside Wichita 40 minutes after Flight 1847 touched down, coordinating with his wing commander about the diversion. He filed his report that afternoon, and in the section of the report where pilots described the situation of the escorted aircraft, he wrote simply, Delta 1847 was handled by the best operator I've ever worked with. The passengers were in the right hands from the moment the emergency began. He did not know Astrid personally. He knew her by call sign and by reputation, the way people in special operations know each other through a network of stories that pass between units on deployments, in training facilities, in the kind of informal conversations that happen between people who do dangerous work and respect other people who do it well. The Yemen hostage rescue was not classified at the highest level, and what was known about it had spread in the way those things spread, without fanfare, just as the thing that Valkyrie had done that night with 12 aid workers and 3 precise decisions. He had not entirely believed the stories were accurate. He believed them now. In the days following the landing at Wichita, while the investigation was being conducted and the media cycle was building toward the moment the reporters found her at the wedding reception, something else was happening that Astrid was not aware of and would not have focused on if she had been. In airports across the country, in the terminals of Dulles and O'Hare and LAX and Atlanta, the story was being told and retold by passengers who had been on the flight, by airline employees who had received the incident briefing, by the paramedics and firefighters at Wichita who had been on the tarmac that morning. It traveled the way the best stories travel, not through official channels but through the informal network of people telling other people something they could not quite stop thinking about. A woman who had been in row 19 told the story to her co-workers on a video call the morning after she arrived home. Tom Briggs from row 14 told it to his wife and then to everyone at his office and then to his father-in-law at dinner that weekend. The nurse Diana Torres told it to every colleague she encountered at her hospital, and more than one of them wept, not at the drama of it but at the particular detail she kept returning to, the woman who had gone into the fire alone and come back out and then kept working, kept moving, kept organizing, as if the fire had been simply one item on a list of things that needed to be done. The mother whose daughter had asked about the clouds being below the airplane, in row 12, told the story differently. She told it to her daughter that night at bedtime, the way you tell stories to children that you want them to remember. She said, "There was a woman on our airplane today who was very brave, and she helped keep everyone safe, and she did it because she had trained for a long time to know what to do when things went wrong, and the lesson from the story was that hard work over a long time makes you ready for moments that other people are not ready for." Her daughter, who was 6 years old and had been frightened on the airplane but had not understood how frightened she should have been, asked if the woman was a superhero. The mother thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Not exactly, but she's the closest thing to one I've ever seen in real life." That was not a bad description. The reporters wrote what she told them. The story was published the next morning and read by millions of people in 3 languages by the end of the day. In living rooms and offices and school classrooms across the country, people read about the tall Nordic woman who had sat quietly in row 8 and put out a fire on a burning aircraft and organized a perfect evacuation and then flown to San Diego for her sister's wedding. In the Pentagon, a 2-star admiral who had initially opposed the integration of women into SEAL teams read the story twice and then forwarded it to 3 colleagues without comment, which was itself a comment. At Naval Special Warfare Command, Astrid's teammates, the ones who were still there, read the story and were not surprised by any of it, because they knew who she was. In Minnesota, her parents read it at the kitchen table with their morning coffee, the same kitchen table where a young girl with ice blue eyes had once told them she was going to join the Navy. Her father read it without speaking. Her mother read it, put down the phone, and said in Norwegian what she always said when Astrid did something that was beyond the scope of ordinary human behavior, "That is my daughter." 3 weeks later, after the Navy's psychiatric evaluation cleared her for return to operational status, a clearance that was processed somewhat faster than usual, given the circumstances, and which her commanding officer was pleased to sign, Lieutenant Commander Astrid Larson repacked her deployment bag, checked her knife, her medical kit, and the small notebook in the left pocket where names were written, and reported back to Naval Special Warfare Command. She did not talk about Flight 1847 with her teammates. There was nothing to talk about. She had been in a crisis situation. She had done what was required. She had brought everyone home. That was the job. That was who she was. That was all.